first heard about climate change when I was 12 years old. This was around the same time as one of the most powerful El Nino events. Because I was 12, so I knew everything, it was obvious to me that the climate scientists just hadn't heard about El Nino. And anyway, I was more interested in trying to look like Britney Spears than I was in global weather patterns. 20 years later, I no longer have the luxury of getting to choose my interest in fashion over concern for the environment, because they're two sides of the same coin. And here's why. The global clothing industry is one of the most polluting industries in the world. It is responsible for 10% of global annual greenhouse gas emissions. That's more than the emissions of all airlines and maritime shipping combined. If things don't change, by 2050, the clothing industry will use 1/4 of the world's carbon budget. Over the next century, the global temperature is set to rise 3 to 5 degrees, even though nations around the world have pledged to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees. Climate change is going to make our planet unrecognizable and possibly inhospitable. And this is happening right now. By the middle of August last summer, over 500 fires raged across British Columbia. Do you remember last summer? Do you remember the air quality? This is our new normal. Where will you go if fires threaten your community this summer? Where do you think you can go to escape climate change? The bulk of the carbon emissions driving climate change come from our major industries. Hearing about the impact of global industries like the clothing industry can make us feel like we aren't the problem, or that the issues are too big and we aren't capable of affecting change, like we aren't responsible on an individual level. But these industries exist to supply us with the things that we buy every day. We are the reason these industries exist. We are responsible, especially those of us who live in the world's richest countries, including Canada, where although we make up half of that population, we are responsible for 86% of total annual greenhouse gas emissions. So here's some scary facts. Over 750 million people around the world do not have access to clean drinking water, and yet the clothing industry uses 4 billion liters of water every day. The toxins used to treat fabrics are reducing human lifespans and destabilizing ecosystems. Our polyester clothes shed microplastics that are decimating marine life and showing up in our food and our drinking water. And cotton farming uses the most herbicides and pesticides of any agricultural crop, and these chemicals are slowly poisoning our soils and our freshwater sources. It can be hard to know what to do with these facts. They're so impersonal, and they're easy to ignore. And it's also worth mentioning that these are the issues that the clothing industry is actively working towards addressing. The clothing industry is making a genuine effort to become more sustainable. But it's not just how our clothes are made that is the problem. It's the amount of clothing that is being produced. And what drives overproduction? We do. Together, we buy 80 billion new items of clothing every year. Just let that sink in. So who bought new clothes within the past 2 weeks? What about the past month? Today, the average lifespan of an item of clothing is 3 years, but more than half of what we buy, we throw out within 1 year. And I do mean throw out. Over 80% of our unwanted textiles go to landfill. Of the clothes that we do donate, only 10 to 20% are actually resold locally. The other 80 to 90% are recycled or sent to landfill or shipped to other countries, primarily in Africa, where our unwanted clothes are unraveling local fashion systems, fashion industries, or ending up in their landfills. So this isn't just an issue of how our clothes are made. This is about how much clothing we are consuming. We are destroying the planet to make clothes that we don't even want. clothes that we don't even like enough to hold on to for a few years, let alone a lifetime. I bought my first copy of Vogue magazine when I was 16 years old. It was the September issue, and so thick that I understood why people called it the fashion Bible. Opening it was like finding something that I hadn't known I was missing. It showed me a world of art and culture and style, of creative people leading interesting lives. It gave me access to a kind of reality that I had never experienced, but that I craved. I bought another issue a few months later, and by then I was hooked. For a long time, that magazine acted as a kind of lifeline for me, as a promise that someday I would find a place where I belonged. About a decade later, I was in graduate school and trying to decide what to write my master's thesis on. And I thought, why don't I write about fashion? I wanted to write about the fantasy and the glamour of high fashion, but one of my advisors began to push me to think about the other side of fashion. She asked me to think about where my clothes came from, about who made my clothes and where they went when I gave them away. And this was how I started to learn about the environmental impacts of the clothing industry. Even after graduating, I kept reading and I kept learning about the environmental impacts, but also about how the industry operates. And it was my need to do something with that learning that inspired me to start my not-for-profit Think the World Differently. Our focus is on raising awareness about the environmental impacts of clothing overconsumption. Because the more I learned, the more it became clear to me that what this really comes down to is a question of values. Do we value stuff, or do we value the planet? It's really not more complicated than that. Except, actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So let's talk about values. Materialism is a system of values where people prioritize image, status, wealth, or possessions. There's lots of different ways that we express materialism, but one of the most effective and long-standing social cues that people have always relied on to communicate class and wealth have always been clothes, and today is no different. There's a whole field of academic research dedicated to the study of human values. And it's been found that there's certain values that we experience as being complementary. So wanting security and wanting to preserve tradition are complementary, and other values that are in opposition. So wanting to conform opposes wanting to stand out. For the values that are in opposition, a seesaw effect comes into play. The more one value is expressed, the more its opposing value is diminished. The reason that this is important is that we all experience materialism in opposition to values that prioritize the well-being of other people and of nature. So the more materialistic we are, the less we care about our impact on the planet. The only option is major change. Either this change will be forced upon us through climate change, or we can choose to radically alter our collective worldview to one that values the well-being of our planet. The one thing that climate change and environmental degradation make abundantly clear is the fact that everything is connected. So, who here does laundry? When we wash our polyester clothes, the microplastics that they shed don't just stay in the washing machine. They end up in the ocean, where they are ingested by the fish that I will buy at the grocery store for my dinner tonight. Or they end up in our freshwater sources, which feed our drinking water, which will end up in the glass of water that you will give to your child before bed tonight. We are not separate from the earth. Our actions are causing ripples of harm across the planet. The effects may be indirect, but that does not mean that they are not happening or that we are not responsible. So take some responsibility. This is not a problem for someone else to solve. We no longer have the luxury of hoping that someone else will fix this for us, of waiting around for someone else to do something. Change is dependent on you doing something. And when I say you, I mean each of you. I mean each of us. I know that this is scary, but here's the thing. We are a room full of people here. And so suddenly we're no longer individuals single-handedly fighting something too big to understand. When we unify, we become something greater than who we are alone. When we work together, we are stronger and more powerful than you could ever imagine. So what we need now is collective action for the common good. And that means recognizing that we need each other, that we are stronger when we act together, and that we all have a role to play. So my challenge to everyone here is for us to take responsibility for our clothing consumption. And there's lots of ways that we can do this. We can shop secondhand or participate in clothing swaps. We can make an effort to support ethical or sustainable brands. We can repair our clothes instead of throwing them out. But the most impactful thing that we can each do today is to buy less. I know how overwhelming it can feel to always try to make the right choice, or to even know what the right choice actually is. The reality is that we need more ethical and sustainable options made readily available to us. But providing that is actually the responsibility of clothing brands and retailers. But achieving that kind of mainstream sustainability is not possible at current rates of overproduction. So it's our responsibility to send a loud and clear message that we do not condone overproduction. And we do that by reducing our own clothing consumption. For me, this means that I love the clothes that I already own, and I only buy clothes that I intend to keep forever. And in the past 6 months, I have purchased 2 pairs of high-heeled shoes, both used, 1 pair of pants from an ethical brand, and 1 pair of brand new earrings. So before I end my talk, I feel like I should mention that I am an optimistic person, and I genuinely do believe in the transformative power of collective action. I have the word hope tattooed on my wrist. It's not there to remind me to have hope, but rather as a way of making visible the fact that no matter how dark things get, I have hope that someday we will live in a world where we are good to one another and where we are good to our planet. Yes, clothing overconsumption is a big issue, but it becomes so much smaller when we tackle it together. And we're not helpless. It's our collective action that has gotten us into this mess, and it's our collective action that will get us out of it too. So in the name of collective action, I invite each of you to tell someone about what you learned here today. Talk to your friends or your family or your colleagues about why you are choosing to be more mindful about your clothing consumption, because that is how collective action is achieved. That is how we change the world. The clothing industry is not something that is separate from us. It is an industry that we actively participate in every time we buy a new shirt for work or donate an old pair of jeans. The clothing industry does not exist without us. We have the right and the responsibility to call the shots. But so long as we ignore the needs of the planet in favor of our own materialistic desire for a constant supply of brand new clothing, we cannot really fault a clothing industry that gives us what we appear to be asking for. Ask for something different. Thank you.